The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, which Vivienne Holt always said was the cruelest day of the week, too far from the weekend behind her, too far from the one ahead. She turned the thick cream envelope over in her hands. Embossed gold lettering. The Hartwell Foundation Annual Innovation Gala. Black tie. The Meridian Grand, Chicago. And in the bottom right corner, handwritten in blue ink that had bled slightly at the edges, "We need you there." Dr. Kessler. She almost threw it away. Almost. The Hartwell Gala was not the kind of event where a woman like Vivienne felt comfortable. She knew what the room would look like before she even walked in. A sea of tailored gowns on women who treated salad as a personality and networking as a sport. She had been to enough industry events to know exactly where she would stand. Slightly to the left of a conversation she hadn't been invited into, holding a glass of sparkling water she didn't want, smiling at a joke she didn't find funny. But Dr. Kessler had asked, and Dr. Prayer. Kessler was the woman who had given Vivienne her first real job out of grad school, who had read her research proposal at 2 in the morning and called at 7 to say, "This is the best thing I've read in 3 years. So Vivienne pressed the dress she'd bought for her cousin's wedding 2 years ago, the midnight blue one with the structured bodice that actually fit her properly, and she went. She was 31 years old. She had a master's in behavioral economics from Northwestern, and a reputation in her field that was quietly, steadily growing. She also wore a size 18 and had spent the better part of 2 decades being reminded of it by people who thought that was a useful thing to remind her of. Her ex-boyfriend, Fletcher Ames, had been particularly creative about it. She hadn't thought about Fletcher in months. She hadn't needed to. He existed in a sealed-off room in her memory, filed under lessons learned at significant personal cost, and she had been doing just fine keeping that door shut, until she walked into the Meridian Grand and saw him standing 15 feet away from the entrance, wearing a tuxedo and that particular smile of his, the one that meant he'd just said something cutting and was waiting to see if it had landed. Vivienne stopped walking. Fletcher Ames hadn't changed in 2 years. Same sandy hair, same practiced ease, the kind of handsome that photographs well and wears thin quickly in person. He was laughing at something a woman in a white gown was saying, one hand loose around a whiskey glass, and for one horrible second Vivienne considered turning around and walking straight back out through the revolving doors. She didn't. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin by approximately half an inch, and walked toward the coat check. She almost made it. Vivienne. His voice hit the back of her neck like something cold. She turned. Fletcher's smile had changed. It had acquired an edge, the particular edge it got when he had an audience and knew it. The woman in the white gown was watching. 2 men nearby had half turned. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said, and his eyes moved over her in that way she remembered. The slow inventory that always ended somewhere around her waist. "You look," he paused. The pause was intentional. "Exactly the same." It wasn't a compliment. The tone made that very clear. "Fletcher," she said, "neutral, clean." "Still doing the economics thing?" He said, "Economics thing, the way someone says that little hobby of yours. I heard you presented at the Kellner Conference. Bold choice, going regional." The Kellner Conference was international. She had keynoted it. "It was a good event," she said. "I'm sure it was." He tilted his head, and there was something almost playful in his expression which made it worse. "You always were good at making the most of what you have to work with." She felt the words settle over her like something heavy. What you have to work with. 2 years of distance and he could still do it. Make her feel like she was an obstacle someone had generously decided to overlook. She opened her mouth. A voice came from directly behind her left shoulder. "Dr. Holt." It was calm, certain, the kind of voice that doesn't need volume because rooms have been quieting for it for years. She turned. The man standing behind her was not someone she recognized, which was unusual, because Vivienne made it her business to know who was in a room. He was tall, genuinely tall, Not the exaggerated kind, with dark hair threaded through with early gray at the temples and the kind of face that looked like it had been arranged by someone who took the work seriously. He wore a black tuxedo with the ease of a man who hadn't rented it. His eyes, which were a very dark brown, were fixed on Fletcher Ames with an expression of complete and unhurried attention. "I've been looking for you," he said to Vivienne, and then he looked at Fletcher. "I don't believe we've met." "Nathan Vance." Fletcher blinked. Something shifted in his face. The particular recalibration of a man who has just realized he may have misjudged the geometry of a situation. "Fletcher Ames. Are you with the foundation?" "I'm on the board," Nathan said, simply, without emphasis, the way you say something that doesn't require emphasis. Vivienne knew the Hartwell Foundation board. She knew every name on it. She had read the annual report on the flight from Milwaukee 3 weeks ago because she was, in fact, exactly the kind of person who read annual reports on planes. Nathan Vance was not just on the board. Nathan Vance funded the board. The Vance Institute had endowed the Hartwell Foundation's research division to the tune of $40 million 4 years ago, and had quietly doubled that number last year. She had read about it in The Atlantic. She looked at him. He looked back at her, and something in his expression said, "I know you know, and also very clearly play along." "I'm sorry to steal her away," Nathan said to Fletcher, and his tone was the tone of a man who is not sorry at all and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. "We have a dinner placement situation, you understand." Fletcher did not understand, but he also could not say so. Nathan placed one hand at the small of Vivienne's back. Light, not presumptuous, just present, and guided her away from Fletcher Ames and toward the main hall, and Vivienne let him, because she was 31 years old and had a master's degree and was still, somehow, slightly in shock. They walked for approximately 30 feet before he dropped his hand and turned to look at her. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said. "I was walking past. I heard enough." "You didn't have to do that," she said. It came out a little sharper than she intended. "No," he agreed. "I didn't." He seemed unbothered by her tone. "Would you have preferred I didn't?" She thought about what you have to work with. She thought about Fletcher's slow inventory of her body in a room full of people. "No," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more careful than that. "Nathan Vance," he said again, because they hadn't been properly introduced. "I know who you are," she said. "Vivienne Holt, Behavioral Economics." "I know who you are," he said, and the way he said it was different from the way she'd said it. There was something in it that was not the bored recognition of a name on a list. "Your paper on status anxiety and consumer risk tolerance. I had 3 of my analysts read it." She blinked. "What did they think?" "2 of them disagreed with your methodology. One of them sent me a 4-page memo about why you were right." "Which one was right?" "The one who sent the memo," he said, and this time he did smile. And it rearranged his face in a way that was slightly startling. "Come have a drink with me." Not a networking drink. An actual drink. She should have said something measured, something professional, something that maintained appropriate distance. "Okay," she said. They sat at a small table off the main hall, away from the noise and the careful laughter of people performing relaxation. A server brought Vivienne a bourbon she hadn't had to specify. Nathan had simply said she likes the Woodford with the confidence of someone making an educated guess, and he'd been right, which she filed away as something to think about later. "How do you know, Dr. Kessler?" he asked. "She hired me out of grad school, ran my first research group." Vivienne held the glass with both hands. "She's the reason I'm here tonight." "She's the reason most good people are here tonight," Nathan said. "She has a talent for finding people who are worth finding." "And you? Why are you here?" "I'm on the board." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her for a moment, just long enough that she noticed he was doing it, which she suspected was intentional. "I built the Vance Institute because I believe good research is the most undervalued asset in the modern economy," he said. "Events like this one are how I stay connected to what we're funding." Make sure the money is going where it should. And is it? More often than not. He turned his glass on the table. Less often than I'd like. They talked for 40 minutes. She hadn't meant to stay that long. She stayed because he asked real questions, not the questions people asked at events like this, the ones that were just elaborate ways of talking about themselves. But actual questions, the follow-up kind. The kind that meant he'd been listening to what she said before. He had opinions about incentive structures in non-profit research funding that were wrong in an interesting way, and she told him so, and he argued back without getting defensive, and at some point she stopped tracking the time entirely. She did not think about Fletcher Ames at all. At 40 minutes, a man in a dark suit materialized at Nathan's shoulder and murmured something close to his ear. Nathan's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A shift. A focus, like a camera lens pulling into clarity. "I need to step away for a moment," he said to Vivienne. "Will you stay?" "I was planning to find Dr. Kessler," she said. "Find her after," he said, and there was something in the directness of it that she noticed. Not a command, a preference stated plainly. "I'd like to finish this conversation." She stayed. She found Fletcher again at the end of the night, which was not something she'd planned on. He found her, more accurately, appearing at her elbow near the coat check, slightly looser than he'd been 3 hours ago, with the specific energy of a man recalculating. Vivienne. Different tone now, softer, the one he used when he wanted something. "I didn't mean earlier to come across as—" "It's fine," she said. We had something good. I think about that sometimes." She looked at him. She thought about the last 6 months of their relationship, the slow accumulation of small cuts, the way he'd once said, "You'd be so beautiful if you just," and then apparently thought she hadn't heard the rest of the sentence. She thought about the night she'd come home from a conference where 3 different people had told her her work was changing how they thought about something, and he'd asked if she was sure she wasn't being too ambitious for her current position. "I don't think you actually think about it," she said. "Not unkindly. Just accurately. I think you see me doing fine and it bothers you a little." "That's not the same thing." Fletcher opened his mouth. "Fletcher." Nathan Vance had appeared. How, Vivienne was not entirely sure, but he was there. Coat over one arm, car keys already in his hand, with the specific unhurried energy of someone who had arranged to be exactly where he currently was. "I think Ms. Holt's car is ready," he said, which was interesting because Vivienne had taken a cab. Fletcher looked between them. The recalculation happened again, and this time the result appeared to be that there was no play here worth making. "Good seeing you," he said to Vivienne, which meant the opposite of what it said, and walked away. Nathan watched him go with the expression of a man watching weather move across a field, not invested in the outcome, simply noting it. "I don't actually have a car," Vivienne said. "No," he said, "but you were done with that conversation." She looked at him. "You do that a lot? Decide when other people are done with conversations?" "Only when they've already decided and just need the exit made available." He looked back at her. Was I wrong? She had been done with that conversation. She had been done with Fletcher Ames for approximately 2 years and 3 months, and the conversation had confirmed everything she needed confirmed about why. "No," she said. "I'll have my driver take you home." "That's not necessary." "It's November in Chicago," he said. "It's necessary." She rode home in a black car that smelled like good leather, and she looked out at the lake going dark under a moonless sky, and she thought about the way Nathan Vance had said, "I know who you are," not like a piece of information, but like something else, something she didn't have a clean word for yet. He called her office the following Thursday. Not an email, a phone call. To her direct line, which meant he had looked it up, which meant he had taken a deliberate step, which she found notable. "The 4-page memo," he said without preamble. "My analyst wants to cite your follow-up paper in something she's writing. Can I send her your contact information?" "You could have emailed me that," Vivienne said. "I could have," he agreed. She waited. He let the silence sit comfortably, which was itself a form of information. I'm having dinner with 2 economists next Tuesday, he said. At Claremont, the one on Michigan Avenue. If you wanted to join, it would be relevant to your work on status dynamics. Or it might not be. But I think it would. Send me the details, she said. She went to the dinner. It was the most intellectually alive she'd felt in a year. The 2 economists were a married couple who disagreed about everything and were magnificent about it. And Nathan sat at the head of the table and asked questions and listened in that way he had, the way that made her feel like what she was saying mattered beyond the polite duration of a conversation. After he walked her to her cab, genuinely this time, not a constructed exit, and stood on the curb in the November cold without apparent discomfort. "You're very good," he said. At dinner conversation. At thinking. He said it like a fact. You process out loud. Most people who do that lose the thread. You don't. She looked at him under the streetlight. She had been told she was smart before, many times in many tones. The patronizing kind, the surprised kind, the kind that came with an unspoken "for someone like you." This was none of those things. It was just a statement, an observation made with the same directness he seemed to apply to everything. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. "Tuesday next week," he said. "There's a panel on moderating on behavioral interventions in capital markets. I'd like your read on it afterward if you're willing." She said she was willing. Over the following 6 weeks, she learned several things about Nathan Vance. He had built his first company at 26 and sold it at 31, which meant he understood exactly what it felt like to be underestimated by people in rooms that didn't think you belonged there. He drank coffee black and then switched to tea in the afternoon, always at the same time, with the precision of a man whose habits had survived a lot of chaos and were therefore non-negotiable. He had a younger sister in Portland whom he called every Sunday and referred to by a childhood nickname he never explained. He read everything, not performatively, but practically, the way you read when you actually want to know the answer to something. And he looked at Vivienne Holt the way no one had ever quite looked at her before. Not in a way she could point to and say this is the thing. More like the way a room looks different when someone opens a window. Not a single dramatic change, but the quality of the air is different, and you notice it without being able to say exactly when it shifted. He never made her feel like something to be accommodated. He never adjusted his language or his assumptions or the complexity of what he was saying. He talked to her like she was exactly the person she actually was, which sounds like a small thing and is, in fact, not a small thing at all. It was a Sunday in December, late afternoon, and they were in the reading room of the Vance Institute. He'd invited her to see a new research installation that was genuinely extraordinary. When Fletcher Ames entered the conversation again. Not in person, in context. They'd been talking about something else entirely, and she'd made a reference, one of those accidental references, to a period of time when she'd been less certain of herself professionally, less willing to push back, less present in a way she still didn't have complete language for. "What changed?" Nathan asked. She was quiet for a moment. The reading room was high-ceilinged and warm and smelled like old paper and radiator heat. "I was with someone," she said finally, "who was very good at making me feel like my value was conditional, like I was getting away with something, like I should be grateful the ceiling was as low as it was, because at least I had a ceiling." Nathan didn't fill the silence. He let her have it. "It took me longer than it should have to figure out that wasn't a reflection of my limits," she said. "It was a reflection of his discomfort with my limits not being smaller." She expected him to say something like, "That sounds hard," or "I'm sorry," the kind of careful, kind response that was appropriate and also didn't cost anything. He said, "What did you do with the anger?" She blinked. "When you figured it out," he said. "The anger that comes from realizing you let someone make you smaller. What did you do with it?" No one had ever asked her that before. Not once. Not in 2 years. "I wrote the paper," she said quietly. "The one on status anxiety and risk tolerance. I wrote it in 8 weeks. I'd been sitting on the research for 2 years because I thought it was Too much. That it would be read as overreaching. It wasn't overreaching, he said. No, she said. It wasn't. He was quiet for a moment. Outside it had started to snow, the early light kind that accumulated slowly without announcement. I looked him up, Nathan said. After the gala. Your ex. She looked at him. His firm pitched to us 6 months ago, Nathan said. Investment vehicle. We passed. He said it simply, without drama, like it was a piece of information she might find relevant to organizing her understanding of events. Nathan. Not because of you, he said. We passed because the model had a structural problem they hadn't addressed. It was the right call. He paused, though I won't pretend I didn't find the timing satisfying. Vivienne laughed before she could stop herself, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that surprised her. He looked at her when she laughed, and she felt it, the quality of that look. I like you, she said, which was not what she'd meant to say, or possibly was exactly what she'd meant to say. I know, he said, and there was warmth in it, not arrogance. I like you considerably more than is professionally convenient. Is that going to be a problem? He thought about it. She appreciated that he actually thought about it instead of giving her the easy answer. Not unless we let it be, he said. Fletcher Ames had one more entrance to make, and he made it in January. Vivienne heard about it second-hand, then third-hand, and by the time the full picture assembled itself, it was both funnier and more complete than she'd have scripted. He had apparently spent several weeks following the gala making inquiries about Nathan Vance, the kind of quiet, lateral inquiries that were intended to be subtle and were in fact visible from 3 states away to anyone paying attention. What he had apparently been trying to establish was whether Nathan's interest in Vivienne was professional, personal, or some calculation Fletcher could position himself to benefit from. The irony, which was not lost on Vivienne, was that in the weeks Fletcher had spent trying to figure out what Nathan saw in her, he had managed to significantly damage 2 professional relationships that actually mattered to him, people who knew Nathan, who found Fletcher's probing questions about that behavioral economist both transparent and distasteful. Nathan told her this over the phone on a Wednesday evening in a tone of calm amusement. He's a man who cannot tolerate the idea that he might have undervalued something, Nathan said. It's a costly character flaw. It cost me about 2 years, Vivienne said. And produced the paper, Nathan said, which is still the best thing I've read on the subject. I'd rather you hadn't paid that particular tuition. But the work is real. She was quiet for a moment. I spent a long time, she said, being very careful about how much space I took up, not just physically, in rooms, in conversations, in my own field. She wasn't sure where this was coming from, except that the winter had made her reflective, and Nathan had a way of making honesty feel low risk. Several someones, worked very hard to teach me that the less I took up, the more manageable I was, the more tolerable. And now? Nathan asked. Now, I'm trying to remember that taking up space is just existing, she said. It's not an imposition, it's just being a person. You're more than a person, Nathan said. You're a person with very good ideas who doesn't let bad questions go unanswered. That particular combination is rarer than it should be. Nathan. Vivienne. I'm not good at this, she said. Whatever this is. You're excellent at it, he said. You're very slightly terrified of it, which is different. You're not terrified. I'm very slightly terrified, he said. I'm managing. She wore red to the Vance Institute's winter reception in February. She hadn't planned to. She'd planned to wear the safe dress, the reliable one, the one that disappeared in a room. But she'd stood in front of her closet on the evening of the event and made herself ask an honest question. Was she choosing the safe dress because she liked it, or because she wanted to take up less space? The red one was spectacular, and she knew it. Floor-length, deep crimson, cut to fit the body she actually had. She wore the red one. Nathan saw her from across the room when she arrived, and whatever conversation he'd been in the middle of, he finished the sentence and walked toward her with the direct, unhurried certainty of a man who has decided where he is going. You're extraordinary, he said quietly, which was not a comment on the dress specifically, and they both understood that. "I know," she said, and felt it, the truth of it, sitting solidly in her chest for possibly the first time without an asterisk after it. Fletcher Ames was not at the February reception. He had not been invited. This was not discussed and did not need to be. The world that Vivienne Holt had learned to keep herself small inside was still the same world. The rooms were still full of the same narrow expectations and the same tilted scales and the same people who believed a woman's value was a function of her silhouette. But she stood in it differently now. Not because Nathan Vance had told her to. Not because she'd been given permission. Because she had made herself honest about the space she deserved and found that it was, in fact, considerable, and that the people worth keeping in her life were exactly the ones who agreed. I keep thinking about the dress. Not the red one, though that matters too, and I'll get to it. I keep thinking about the safe dress. The reliable one I almost wore because some part of me had been trained, over years and by someone I trusted, to believe that taking up less space was the same thing as being more acceptable. Vivienne almost wore that dress. She almost skipped the gala entirely. She almost swallowed Fletcher's words at the coat check and filed them away with all the other ones, the slow accumulation of small cuts she'd taught herself to call normal. That's how it works, I think. It doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens in the Tuesday evenings, the offhand remarks, the pauses that are just slightly too long before a compliment that turns out not to be one. Fletcher wasn't a villain in a movie. He was just a man who was uncomfortable with a woman who had more to offer than he had room for. And instead of examining that discomfort, he handed it to her and called it feedback. What I find remarkable about Vivienne is not that she survived that. Plenty of people survive diminishment. What's remarkable is what she did with the anger when she finally let herself feel it. She didn't perform it or weaponize it. She turned it into the best work of her career. 8 weeks, 1 paper, the clearest thinking she'd ever done because she'd finally stopped editing herself to fit someone else's comfort level. That's not luck, that's character. The kind that gets built quietly, in the years when nobody's watching, when you're doing the reading and the thinking and the work, even when you're also carrying someone else's low opinion of you around like extra weight. The discipline to keep going when the person who should have believed in you most was the one making you doubt yourself. That doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from something deeper than confidence, something you have to choose over and over again, even when it's inconvenient. And what Nathan understood, which Fletcher never did, is that intelligence is not a problem to be managed. Vivienne's mind was not something to be accommodated or quietly discouraged. It was the most interesting thing in the room. The fact that she came in a body Fletcher had decided to critique was, to Nathan, genuinely irrelevant, not because he was performing enlightenment, but because he was actually paying attention to the thing that mattered. That's what integrity looks like in practice, not grand gestures. Just actually looking at the person in front of you and responding to who they are rather than the story you need them to be. The red dress is the last image I come back to. Vivienne standing in front of her closet, asking herself an honest question, am I making this choice because I want to or because I've been taught to want less? That question, the willingness to ask it, to sit with the uncomfortable answer, to choose differently anyway. That's the whole story. Not the gala, not Fletcher's face when he realized what he'd lost access to, not even Nathan. Just a woman deciding on a Wednesday evening in December that she was done shrinking. I think about that every time I reach for the safe choice. And I ask myself the same question she did.